Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tokyo College's International Women's Day event series, Tackling Biases in Tech and the Workplace. My name is Eureka Fong, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College, the University of Tokyo. I study and design technologies to support equity in online and remote work, such as online freelancing. This interview will be translated into Japanese, so please feel free to hear the audio in Japanese if you'd like. So women continue to face discrimination in the workplace. In 2017, the Pew Research Center found that about 4 in 10 working women in the US have faced discrimination at work because of their gender, such as earning less than male coworkers or being treated as incompetent because they are a woman. In Japan, not only do women earn about 25% less than men on average, but being a man makes it 10 times more likely that one becomes a manager compared to being a woman. The question now is, how do we build more equitable, women-friendly, and family-friendly workplaces? Today, we are talking to Dr. Ho Kwan Cheung, an assistant professor of psychology and the founder of the Girl Lab, the Gender Issues Research Lab at the University at Albany, State University of New York. Ho Kwan has written nearly 20 articles on discrimination in the hiring process based on gender, motherhood, and sexual orientation. She's also worked on strategies for building more women-friendly and family-friendly workplaces, such as making diversity training more effective. I'd like to welcome today Ho Kwan. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Eureka.
Great. Well, so nice to see you. And so for this month for International Women's Day, we're hosting a series of interviews about advocating for equity in our everyday lives, including in the workplace. So I want to start off with kind of like a big question, but I hope it's not too big. What does equity mean to you, Ho Kwan?
What does equity mean? It's funny because I think like the words like equity, equality get thrown a lot around these days, but very few people can actually distinguish among them. So officially, you know, when we think about fairness, when we think about discrimination, we're really thinking about, are people treated the same way? However, that just basically is equality. It's not equity. Equality is, you know, I get paid the same as you do, or I get the same interpersonal treatment as you do. However, that is not addressing the fact that there has been some systemic issues that lead people to be starting off at different points, like the playing field is not level. So equity is really accounting for these historical systemic differences and provide support to those who have less resources or start off at a lower place so that they can eventually have the opportunity to rise to the same place. So a very quick example could be, you know, in general, women, especially women of color, have access to fewer social capital because they don't have as big of a social network. So saying that they're treated equally would be like they are invited to all the same events or they are given the same sort of assignments. However, that's not accounting for the fact that they have a smaller social network to draw from. So something to adjust for that could be, you know, establishing some type of women's networking group or women's mentoring group so that it could help them make up for that difference. So equity is focusing more on the end rather than the process itself.
I think you put that really, really nicely, kind of like making up for that difference and like focusing on the ends is really important. So thank you so much for sharing that. So I'd like to give you a little bit of time and space now to tell us a little bit more about yourself and the projects that you're doing right now. Can you give us a quick overview of the ongoing projects that you're most excited about in this space?
Yeah, so as Eureka has very kindly introduced earlier, I have done a lot of work related to gender and family. I am broadly interested in all things diversity and discrimination oriented, but to me, gender has always held a, you know, I've always been particularly fascinated by it. Because in my opinions, gender is probably one of the oldest form of discrimination in the world, because since, you know, prehistoric times, there have been a traditional division of labor between men and women, partially due to our biological differences. but those division of labor shape the norms, shape the roles that we're supposed to occupy. And then because of all of these differences and other social forces, we come to regard men's labor as higher in value, and then we come to see women's labor as less valuable, less worthy. So for me, understanding gender discrimination, it's really understanding the heart of why we discriminate to begin with. Like, why are we systematically seeing 50% of our world population differently? And if you really want to understand gender issues, it will be a huge oversight to not account for family, considering those are one of the biological differences that attribute to these differences socially for men and women. So we have to account for the role that women and family play together, intertwine together to explain these differences. And I think some of the projects I've done understanding these effects could be, I've done a fair amount of work looking at pregnant women. So I've looked at what are the experiences of pregnant women as they navigate pregnancy, which is a psychologically and physically very demanding time period of their lives. Nowadays, many pregnant women continue to work through their pregnancies. I've also done some work looking at systematic hiring discrimination against working moms. So this is not just pregnancy. This is about like postpartum motherhood. And then more recently, I've been doing some work looking at breastfeeding support or lack thereof for mothers in the workplace. I think there was a, not that recent, but like in the past year or two, there were a Japanese female legislator who made it to news quite famously because she just gave birth and had to breastfeed her baby, in the middle of a session. So she brought her child with her, to the meeting, and that was a huge uproar. So given that we have large portions of women, especially mothers in the workforce, through their whole family formation stage, something like breastfeeding should also be taken into account in the workplace. So I'm doing some projects on that. And then on the other side, as Eureka has mentioned, I'm doing work looking at how to address discrimination in the workplace. So two of the projects right now I'm doing, one is trying to incorporate some skill-based components to diversity training so that we can give people some skills to not rely so much on stereotypes and instead be more mindful in their behaviors to other people. And then I'm also looking at some reasoning or some decision-making process that goes into people's mind when they make judgments about sexual harassment incidents. Because understanding how organizations respond to incidents have a direct impact on whether it will happen again or not.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing a little bit more about that. And I was just thinking a little bit about what you said about like the breastfeeding of workplaces point as well. I was just reading in a book about, it's a fictional book, but also in fiction it was also an issue of how like where can mothers breastfeed in the workplace. And so it's really exciting to hear that you're working on some of these topics in your work. Yeah, and I'd love to hear more also about diversity training. So I'll talk to you a little bit more about that in the rest of the interview. So before we get into kind of strategies for more equitable workplaces, women-friendly, family-friendly workplaces, I was wondering if you could help the audience better understand why this topic is important. As you mentioned before, gender is one of the oldest forms of discrimination, and there are so many forms of discrimination against women in the workplace. So what's one type of gender discrimination at work that you're most concerned about, and why?
That is a very interesting question. Right, I mean, as I've mentioned before, gender discrimination exists in many different forms. There are the more conventional ones, like we think about the gender wage gap, hiring differences between men and women. And then there are also the more difficult to quantify ones like harassment. But for me, in my opinion, the most serious form of discrimination is basically the way that women's lives will be affected by family. So I think, like, let's just, for the past 50 years, we have come a long way in having women being part of the workforce. Obviously it differs by country. In some countries there are higher female participation, in some countries they're lower, but on average, women participation in the workforce has dramatically increased. So right now, the idea of women working is not as outlandish as it used to be. However, some really interesting research have shown that while people's attitude toward women working have massively improved, people's opinions about mothers working have mostly stayed the same. So it comes to basically, what it suggests is that we have wider acceptance of women, pursuing their careers, but it's only under the condition that they would also be able to take care of their families. So in a way, we have sort of make way for women to be able to pursue their career interests if they choose to, yet still holding them to some traditional standards, particularly when it comes to family. And this applies to women, regardless whether they have family or not, regardless of their life choices. Obviously, the most obvious set is going to be, women who do become mothers. Large portion of today's workforce will have children, and oftentimes moms do remain in the workforce after having children. So understanding how do people view them differently as they go through that life transition is important. And we know that there are evidence suggesting that family plays a huge role. So at least I know that in westernized countries, wage gap between men and women when you first start your career nowadays is actually relatively narrow, but it dramatically widens 10 to 15 years after they start their career, basically around the time they start having children. So accounting for that will be important. However, that just doesn't mean that it only affects women who have children. There's also some recent research that suggests what we call like the maybe baby effect. So when people hire women, there is a general expectation that you will have children someday. Having children is very normative within our society. We like seeing people, having a normal family, getting married, having children. It signals stability and normalcy. So even if a woman do not have children or may not even be married, there's this sort of idea in people's mind that someday she's going to go through those steps. And because of the societal expectation of, moms will be primarily focusing on children and perhaps not being able to devote as much time or resources, or frankly, maybe not even interested in devoting time and resources in their careers, these sort of expectations drive them to treat women differently. So family is a very important factor, regardless of whether in reality you have a family or not. And that's what I see as sort of like the key of really understanding how do we make the workplace more equitable, because you cannot disentangle gender and family, regardless of whether you have a family or not.
Yeah, I haven't heard of the term maybe baby effect, but I'm going to start using that. That's quite interesting. I hadn't really, I also do this kind of research, but, I hadn't really thought about it that way. Just, even if I'm not married or if I don't have children, that perception could be, in people's minds and people's heads. And yeah, that definitely affects, women's lives. What's the consequence of this? Like you mentioned, it affects people's perceptions of women. Like where does that show up? Does it show up in wages? Does it show up in, how women are, approached for leadership positions?
Yeah, so it manifests also in many different ways. So obviously looking at like what I mentioned just now, there's a wage differences, although the exact number differs depending on how you look at it. I think by one estimation, mothers earn about 30% less than fathers. And then by a different estimation, and that's based on more robust evidence, that there's a thing called premium of 1 to 3% for every child they have. So that's like on the more tangible economic outcomes, but that can also show up in every single day treatment. So there's a fair amount of research suggesting that even when women have really established themselves as capable professionals, they feel like people are viewing them in a different light as soon as they become pregnant and transition to being a mother. Sort of like they feel the idea of like being pushed out, unless they go above and beyond to establish their sort of like reinforce their commitment to work. And family is just overall seen as sort of a distraction, so to speak, even though it's something that many people do. Like, for example, I think like some of the American tech companies, they start offering things like helping female employees to freeze their eggs so that they can put off the family a little bit longer, or providing services for female employees to send their breast milk back to their children so that they can go travel while they're still breastfeeding their children. Like all of this is just really conceptualizing family as this thing that employees should really manage, control as much as possible because it's a distraction from work. And that sort of have an impact on you if you think that like systematically your organization or your workplace really don't care about you outside of work. They only care about how you perform and what value you can bring to them. Obviously, you know, in any workplace, we should be concerned about whether people are performing and producing the adequate value. But seeing them as no more than that has a really dehumanizing sort of effect. And we also see that, for example, in leadership opportunities, I mean, there's tons and tons of research showing that women have been sort of passed over for leadership opportunities because they're seen as, you know, not decisive enough or not independent enough. One exception being with the glass cliff effect. You know, women are oftentimes more likely to rise to leadership positions when there's a crisis going on and people feel like, okay, we have to make a change. But in reality, when things didn't continue to go, didn't improve, you just replace it with another man because it's kind of like, oh, we tried something different. It still didn't work. One of the other area that area of research that start to show is that people also have very negative perceptions toward older women. Older women sort of report being like the more invisible part of the workforce. They continue to be for the workforce, and in reality, they have a lot to contribute. Consider that maybe their children has grown up already, so they're not as tied up by family responsibilities as they used to. They have more experience now, so they're probably more ready to step up their leadership opportunities. But because older women are just sort of this, you know, thing that exists in the background, they're still not given sort of the consideration that they deserve. So I think all of these ways basically disadvantage women in both the quality of their everyday lives, as well as the more tangible outcomes that translate into money.
Yeah, no, that's thank you for like giving kind of an overview of that. And yeah, I guess I also just keep going back to like, you know, what you said earlier as well, that like, and people brought this up to me as well. Like, it seems like the gender gap is closing, and in many ways it is, but also there are these other dimensions like motherhood and age that intersect with gender as well. And as you're saying, like discrimination still exists along those lines. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So I'm actually really excited about the next part of the interview, since, you know, we've talked about all the challenges that women are currently facing in the workplace. And for the audience, Ho Kwan actually joined us last year as well on a panel about women in the workplace. And this is where we talked about a lot of challenges that women are seeing, but we didn't have enough time to talk about strategies or solutions moving forward. So so in this next part, I want to talk to you about, you know, what are some strategies that we could take to kind of address these issues. So you've done some work on diversity and harassment training, which are kind of just one way to build more women-friendly and family-friendly workplaces. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that training is and why it's effective or ineffective?
So diversity or harassment training are basically some type of organizational learning courses where you inform people about the laws, the regulations, as well as basically like what this thing is, discrimination, harassment. Because if you ask your everyday person, they may only have a limited view. You know, when people think of discrimination, they think about being paid differently. When people think harassment, they think like physical touches. They're not aware of a lot of the nuances. And so training can serve as a way to really broaden people's conception what this is, because you first need to be able to identify it. And then training is also supposed to inform people with regards to what is the existing law saying about it and where the companies stand on it. Ideally, though many trainings don't do that, it will also give people some skills to know how they handle difficult situations if these incidents occur. So for example, if you witness a coworker making an inappropriate joke to another female coworker, how can you address that? Or if you are a supervisor and you see, two of your subordinates, one treating another one very rudely and without good reason, how can you address that? Unfortunately, the skill part is like there's a lot of variability among trainings. The really good quality training will address that. But a lot of the, what we call off the shelf, like generic training, really only focus on the knowledge part. And that is part of the reason why the research so far have not been promising when it comes to the effectiveness of training. I think the reason why it's not promising are twofold. Number one, we're expecting too much from training. You're talking to people who come into work and they have already lived their lives for anywhere from 2 to 7 decades. How can you possibly expect their opinions to wildly, dramatically change after 2 hours? It's just not going to happen. That's not how things work. So consistent with that, research has shown that training is effective in increasing people's knowledge, but it doesn't necessarily shift their attitudes. So I think that what people should really focus on is not so much about fundamentally changing people's attitudes, but really focusing on the behaviors. The second reason why I think it doesn't work is that a lot of times we are just thinking training as learning, and we apply all these traditional ways of, we know a lot about how to make people learn better, right? But we're not teaching something that is as impartial as like learning a new software. We're learning about something that is very emotionally laden. It touches on people's values, and quite frankly, in many people's mind, have nothing to do with the job. Doing well in this training isn't going to get your promotion. It's not going to, make you more desirable in front of your boss's eyes. It's kind of this thing that you have to do because your organization wants you to be nice with other people. So when we think about it as like a traditional learning experiences, it just doesn't quite fly. So what I would argue, and that's what some of my research is trying to focus on right now, is rather than trying to teach people the way we would teach any technical knowledge, perhaps we should really focus on understanding the process of discrimination and then trying to intervene with that psychological process. So one of the things that we have come up with is, for example, perspective taking. So a lot of times discrimination occurs because we lack understanding of the other groups, and therefore we rely on stereotypes. Well, if we teach people to be more empathetic, take other people's perspectives, perhaps then you realize, oh, they're not that different from me, or they do this thing because they have this reason, instead of them just being a terrible human being. Having that perspective will lead you to be more mindful of your behavior. Other ways that we're working on is, for example, practicing mindfulness. So mindfulness is a clinical approach that have Buddhist roots in it. But basically, modern day mindfulness is really about being more present moment aware and being less judgmental, like kind of delay your emotional reactivity. So instead of seeing someone, okay, that person is a younger woman, and automatically think that she's going to have a baby sometime, you may want to actually get to know that person first. Like, don't rely so much on heuristics as like a knee-jerk reaction. Focus on the detail right now, talk with that person and see how they react, and then make your judgment. So those are what we would think can possibly help increase the effectiveness of diversity or harassment training, with the end goal very much on, it's about the behaviors. Of course, it would be great if we can also change people's attitudes. But quite frankly, as I joke, that's somebody else's jobs. We should do that in schools. We should do that, in parenting. By the time they get to workplace, they're kind of beyond being parented into having different attitudes. So we should really just focus on the behaviors and what kind of skills can people have to allow them to interact with each other in more harmonious ways.
That's really interesting, especially like the mindfulness kind of practice and like bringing that in. I'm kind of curious actually if you think that like in your research so far, is it very specific to like the kind of behavior, like the gender-based behavior that you're seeing, or do you think it could be something that like plays a role like regardless of the behavior? Like, is mindfulness just good in general for that, or does it have to be very targeted?
So mindfulness has been applied to many different settings. I know, so originally this concept in modern day research come from clinical psychology as part of the therapeutic approach to help people gain better acceptance of themselves. So really focusing on the moment, not thinking too much about all the anxieties and the worries, and also come to terms with themselves. So if you look at traditional mindfulness training, it actually teaches you how to mindfully listen, how to mindfully observe, how to mindfully walk. So not just like sort of, I think like all of us sort of go through our day in like semi-automated fashion, right? Like right now I know that like if I need to go somewhere, I get out, grab my keys, go to my car and drive to whatever. Like we don't really think much. So mindfulness is really trying to bring that awareness back and be aware of what we touch upon every single day. There's been some research looking at having mindfulness apply to, for example, relationship building or communications. But so far, the research on mindfulness is still mostly limited to sort of like personal enhancement, for lack of a better word. Like, how do you take better care of yourselves? How do you communicate with your partner a little bit better? Or how do you work with a team better? And what we are trying to do, and this research is still in the works, but we have a little bit of some evidence, promising evidence to suggest that we can also take that skill one step further and try to be accepting not only of yourself and be aware of yourself, but also of other people. So mindfulness in of itself is not target specific in that sense. It can be applied in many different ways, but we also think that it needs to be tailored. So like, I can't just teach you how to mindfully listen to a bell and then expect you to take that and then like apply to everyday interactions. I need to sort of build the skills of like, okay, now we're going to do a different activity looking at social interaction. Now we're going to look at, do some role play and do that to allow people to be able to translate those skills.
Right. I think, I think as you mentioned before, like learning is such a big part of the work that you're doing. And yeah, it's interesting to see like, oh, do these kind of skills like transfer to this domain, or like how do you structure that to sort of fit this specific challenge? So one other thing that I've been thinking about is the role that that men play in this, this whole equation. What is one thing that men can do to help build more women-friendly workplaces?
I think one of the things that is important for men to do is, one, being more aware. Part of being, for lack of a better term, the highest status group in society is that you're not as aware of the things that you have are not enjoyed by everybody else. That holds true not just for men, but for basically any time you have a majority group that enjoy a more privileged position. So one very good example is that I remember when the Me Too movement first broke out, some of the men are very surprised that women oftentimes feel afraid of walking home alone at night, or like, a lot of women are taught to like, make sure you hold your keys, in between your fingers when you cross a parking lot. Like for them, that's just like, oh, and that's just because they never personally encounter it. And of course, when they walk with a woman, the women will not be afraid and do not react the same way either. So I think one of the first things that men can do is just taking other people's perspectives and step outside their box a little bit to see how other people's experiences are. And then I also think that we need to stop thinking about family as a womanly thing. I think that, when people talk about like family friendliness, they often just equate that with like, it's a women's issue. We're trying to make it more women friendly. But in reality, family is a human issue. It involves both genders. A natural biological birth involves a male and a female. And there is no reason why systematically all men do not want to participate in their family. So seeing that these are not women's issues, but also like issues that all human beings face in the working population can help reshift the focus onto, this is not about catering to a specific population, but accommodating something that is very natural and quite frankly, crucial to our survival as a species. The fact that women are disadvantaged because of family have some implications on men too, right? So we know that men are face more negative perceptions when they request for family leave, because the idea is that like your wife is the one who's giving birth, you're not, so why do you need that much time off? Or men face more backlash when they want to partake in family activities, so they have to leave work early or something like that. So this is a system, our gender roles are hurting not only women, but also men. When in reality, these are things that are not particularly gendered, such as caretaking work, and can be participated by both genders. And the whole idea isn't to force one person to do another, but rather allow people the opportunity to participate if they want to. So I think that like sort of thinking more broadly about these issues, particularly when it comes to family, as well as gaining more awareness, can help men be better allies to supporting women in the workplace.
Yeah, no, I think like your message around like, gender roles hurt both men and women, and how we're really all like very much connected to one another, and we can't just see one issue as like another issue that doesn't involve us. I think that's really important for everyone to remember. So I want to touch a little bit more about some strategies, and then I think we can wrap up today. But so I guess some of the work that you're doing and the training that you brought up, it's something that like are initiatives that you hear coming up from like really high up in a company or an organization. But I'm sure a lot of people in the audience, they're not representing, the organization, but they're managers or their team leaders, or they have a few mentees that they mentor. So for myself, I manage some research assistants for my own research projects. Are there any strategies that you like or would recommend for managers or team leaders to create more women and family-friendly workplaces?
So, you asking a question remind me of something rather cheesy, but nevertheless hold true. The people make the place. So in reality, every day when people interact with others at work, they're not interacting with the upper management who set the rules. They're interacting with their coworkers and their supervisors. So if supervisors and coworkers are willing to sort of set the norm, establish some sort of behavioral expectations, it can make a huge difference. So an example of that, I've done some research looking at sexual harassment training effectiveness. And what we found is that even though if an individual are skeptical about the organization's efforts to make changes, like, oh, I don't think you do that because you want to improve women's lives and have less sexual harassment. You just want to do it because you don't want to be sued. That's a very widespread sentiment. So individuals feeling that are less likely to pay attention to the sexual harassment training. However, that negative effect can be mitigated if they feel like they're surrounded by people more close to them that will do the right thing when it needs to be. So I can be very skeptical of my organization, really caring about my well-being or really caring to make the workplace better for women. But I know that if something happens, my supervisor or my coworker will be willing to address it adequately instead of brushing it aside. They will be willing to stand up for me. That makes a lot of differences because in reality, the people closest to us is the one that we see and interact with the most every day. So although the organization has a very powerful influence because of the ability to make rules and regulations, it is really the people closer to us that make the difference on an everyday basis. And I think that we as supervisors, as team leaders, as a coworker to somebody else, we have a responsibility to the best that we can, try to be mindful of these things and try to do the right thing. And do the right thing doesn't always mean I'm going to challenge the system. It could be something as simple as like offering a year to listen to it when someone feel like they have been mistreated, or be more flexible with work schedules when you know that you have one coworker who has a sick child at the moment and need some leeway with his schedule so that he can take the kid to doctor's appointments. These are things that doesn't quote unquote necessarily you're not starting a revolution, but these little small considerations can make a huge difference on other people's lives.
Yeah, and I think this goes back again to what you said earlier about just like how everything's like really connected, and it's not just these policies that are coming from the larger organization, but the people that actually that live there and work in the organization that give you the perception of whether you feel comfortable or safe to work in that space. Yeah, I think that's super powerful. So I do want to wrap up, and I just want to wrap up our conversation today by asking you what's next for you as a researcher promoting more women and family-friendly workplaces. I know you've talked a little bit about the projects, but what can we look forward to?
So a lot of the work I have focused so far are very much on early motherhood, and for good reasons, right? Like those, that is probably one of the major hurdles that women will face after they enter the workforce. However, that doesn't just stop there. Our lives are consistently changing as we go through the aging process. So one of the things that I alluded to earlier, but I do actually have an ongoing interest and would like to examine it further, is looking at men and women in the midlife. Why are we still seeing gender differences in leadership positions when technically the playing field is a little bit more level at midlife because family is no longer as big of a factor? So I would like to see how does gender and age intersect together to explain some of these differences, and how can we bring older women from being invisible to more forefront in sort of the everyday workings of the organization. I also have some sort of early work looking at how parents experiencing discrimination may have impact on not just their own personal well-being, but also their children. Because in reality, none of us can completely compartmentalize ourselves between work and family. We may not talk about work in family time or vice versa, but we're still the same person. So something is going to impact. And you would think about if you experience discrimination every single day, that's a really chronic stressor that is bound to show up somehow in the family. So I kind of want to look beyond just the individual and start seeing what are other sort of downstream effects of discrimination or mistreatment onto other aspects of an employee's life. So we have found some preliminary evidence suggesting that parents who experience chronic discrimination have children that have a little bit more socio-developmental issues. Perhaps because the parents are usually stressed out or angry. Maybe it's because the parents sort of have a very negative view in life, and just tell the children that the life isn't fair and they would never get what they want. Like I don't really know the reasons, because this area of research is so unexplored. But I think it would be both fascinating but also important to look at what is discrimination doing, not just to the people who are working, but to the entire society, because these children will grow up to be working adults as well. And having this sort of background obviously feed into what kind of employee they will be and what kind of workforce we are forming. So those are the two big directions I would like to take my research to. Lots of unknowns, lots of speculations, but hopefully new food for thought for us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's super exciting. And I love how you're thinking just about, again, like not just the effect on women, but really all parts of society. So I wish you all the best with all of your work. Is there anything else you'd like to add or to say to our audience before we wrap up?
I think the only last thing I like to say, which you have reiterated, is that these are not women's issues or mothers' issues or children's issues, because of the interconnectedness within our society. You may have children, you may not. You may plan to have children, you may not. You may have children that is grown up, or you may not. But these issues still permeate through, because both work and family in different forms. I don't mean it just with children, certainly there are a lot of people with elder care responsibilities, or taking care of sick family members. Family very broadly and work are both two very important domains of our lives. So we have to find a way to balance both, to juggle both. And because work oftentimes have a greater hold on people's lives because of the financial sort of ties that come along with it, it is up to the employers to allow employees to better accommodate other responsibilities in their lives, particularly family. Trying to ignore that as a thing is just sort of erasing the humanity of employees.
Yeah, thank you so much again for sharing your thoughts. And I think that was a great way to wrap up and conclude what we've been talking about so far. Thank you so much again, Ho Kwan, for your time today. This has definitely helped me better understand what I can do myself to contribute to more friendly, women-friendly workplaces. And thank you in the audience for joining us as well. So all this month, we are hosting interviews with women who are tackling biases in tech in the workplace. So be sure to check out the Tokyo College YouTube channel for more videos like this. And if you'd like to learn more about Ho Kwan's work or Tokyo College, please visit the links in the description below. Also, if you'd like to learn more about my own work on closing gender pay gaps in online work, please visit my website in the link below, and leave any questions there or on Twitter. So thank you again, and bye for now.
Thank you.